Right, okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for making it. It looks better with people at the front. It looks a bit cozier. Let's just start with introductions, because that's probably the best place to start. Maxi, do you want to start by introducing yourself?
I thought as the host you would, but
Nope.
hello.
I can if you want.
Go for it.
Okay, so Maxi, program director at SproutX. Those of you who don't know SproutX, you're probably missing out, because SproutX is one of the best-known accelerators within this space in Australia. As far as I know, as far as I can tell, companies that have gone through SproutX programs, which range from the pre-accelerator stage all the way to the acceleration stage, have raised upwards of $30 million in venture capital investment. Current portfolio value of alumni exceeds, well, somewhere in the region of $100 million, so extremely successful. And you're sort of leading the way in collaborating between industry, academia, and startups in the AgTech sector.
Yes.
Would you like to add anything, Max?
Well done. Appreciate it. I thought you were going to introduce yourself. But yes, as Fabio has mentioned,
Nope.
I'm
Maxi.
You can see that we rehearsed this.
We totally did. We caught up in a meeting room at my office yesterday, and that's probably it. But hello, everyone. Howdy. Welcome to the Capital Coffee and Hay Fever. We're very lucky and very excited to have all of you here. As Fabio has mentioned early on, I'm Maxi. I am the program director of an AgTech agri-food tech, same, accelerator program. We have started around 2016. Fast forward now, we have a portfolio of 37. And since the start of last year, we have attracted 130 future founders, as we like to call it, to really affect innovation in this space. But over to Matt.
Yeah, hey everyone, great to see you all here. The most important thing to know is that we're very confused about whether to call it AgTech, Agri-Tech, or Agri-Food Tech. Regard those terms as interchangeable, certainly in Australia and I think elsewhere. Yeah, Matthew Pryor, I'm the co-founder of a sector-specific early-stage venture capital firm based, well, in Australia, not really in any particular state, called Tenacious Ventures. My background prior to that was as a founder in the kind of tech world and then in the early AgTech world. I know I don't look old, but I actually have been doing it for 15 plus years. $35 million funds under management first fund, 14 investments, generally pre-seed and seed investing, largely Australian originated, but not exclusively. So of those 14 companies, 11 are legit, like originated in Australia, 3 international, probably more North American focus in terms of kind of second geographies for us.
Can I add some more? I just feel like there's a lot more accolade to Matt that he hasn't mentioned as well. So Australia's first AgTech dedicated fund. All right, so that's a milestone. But as if it wasn't enough, Matt has also gone and founded AgTech, Australian AgTech, which is an advocacy group for essentially just for AgTech, everything in general. And they've just hosted the Australians' first AgTech Awards in June in Sydney. And someone got a little bit emotional because that's definitely very much a big milestone. It was pretty cool.
Great. Thank you. Well, I don't need to introduce you, Matt, anymore. I'll introduce myself very quickly. I'm Fabio. I wear 2 hats. On one side, I work for a consultancy company called Oxentia. We're based in Oxford in the UK. And we do anything across innovation management as a consultancy. So all the way from helping universities commercialize research, all the way to working with startups and founders, fundraising or helping them set up companies. I also I don't have the same experience that Matt does, but I am also starting to get into the venture capital space as one of the 3 partners in a new small fund coming out of Turkey, doing investments in sustainability and climate innovation out of Turkey. So, the point of today's session, which has been, the title has been crafted by someone else as Growing the Future. What we would like to get to today is trying to understand from first principles, what do we mean by innovation in AgTech, or in agriculture in general? Who are the people that we consider the innovators within this space? And then moving forwards, what are models to actually try understanding why place and geography is important when talking about agricultural innovation? just a bit of context about the sector and about why we need this innovation. I'm sure everyone knows this because it's been all over the news, well, for obvious reasons, but worldwide agriculture as a sector contributes to roughly 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. It contributes to roughly 30% of energy use and 70% of water extraction and water use globally. Some countries, especially on the water side, that goes up to 90%. Some countries is slightly better. We also know that with growing population, there are estimates that we'll need to increase food production by 50-60% by 2050. Which puts a huge pressure on the grower side and on the whole supply chain, with at the same time the added pressure of the need to decarbonize and to make the whole thing more sustainable. So part of what we're trying to understand here is, where does innovation fit into this? How does innovation and new technology allow us to both increase productivity and make the whole industry a bit more sustainable and a bit more friendly for the planet? Oh, I thought there was a train. Oh, sorry. And so let's start from that. Let's start with the idea of, what do we mean by innovation in ag and in agriculture in general, in food production and in anything that links to the supply chain. Matt, do you want to start? Maxi, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll have a go. And actually, a lot of it really has to do with the backstory behind Tenacious Ventures. It's something that people know a lot about Australia, is that, historically, we've been known as a dry continent. I mean, for a start, 50% of land mass is dedicated to agricultural production, so a large geographic area, but a lot of that geography is, in relative terms, pretty harsh as far as agricultural production is concerned. So managing precious resources, particularly, soil health and water availability, have always been concerns in Australia. But when we have thought about that, really, historically, we've largely thought about making Australian farmers better. So we've been a long-term, multi-decade investor in innovation in agriculture, both that originated on-farm from farmers and, increasingly over the decades, co-funded by levies that farmers pay in different ways, and co-investment by both state and federal government. So, it just seemed like we needed to be doing more with that. There was so much innovation that related to what eventually, everybody is starting to feel, which is, what is producing food and fibre outdoors going to feel like in a highly variable, increasingly hostile climate. I mean in terms of the things that you would like to hold constant when you're producing crops. And so there is this background, certainly, of innovation, even with respect to farmers. Like, we sort of joke about, making things out of, baling twine, and like, you've always had to be adaptive. Australia, again, going back to the kind of geography, generally our regional areas where agriculture is conducted they're not near urban centres, they're not near transportation centres, and so if something breaks, you have to be able to fix it yourself. So that's kind of it's a pretty high baseline, and we have always thought that farmers are much more like entrepreneurs than your kind of average citizen, and that's sort of I guess the perspective we took into thinking about, it's great that we did it. Australia is the second least protected agricultural economy in the world. New Zealand is the least protected, and so that's really where the investment comes from. If we're not going to get market protection, we have to be as efficient as we can possibly be, and efficiency, resource conservation, profit maximisation absolutely relies on innovative approaches. So that's sort of the baseline that we saw, and I think is an interesting starting point from thinking about, okay, how do we scale that up?
Matt's pretty much covered all of it. The perspective that I have into this space, coming from someone who's actually non-ag, I am ex-FMCG, I come into this space, and just kind of like anyone going into new space, you kind of want to define what this big thing is. And it's really interesting how, coming from a program perspective, we've got a lot of applicants come through, and then it's just kind of like really hard to say, where do we draw the line? What's ag? What doesn't make, what isn't ag tech? I know the government has their own set of definition, and then the startup side of things have their own definition, and then specific programs also have, the circular economy side, the energy side of ag, and food side of ag too. Hence Matt previously mentioning ag food. And I think for us in Sproutix, really anything that can go into really scale and innovate the producers, the ag industry, back into the space essentially. So that covers a lot, and then we do see a lot of kind of like sides to say, for example, you've got a microgrid company that helps refugee camps, but because tech are so agnostic, you can also use that for dairy farms as well. So then where do you really draw the line? One thing that Matt has mentioned that I absolutely love is the idea of farmers as entrepreneurs or the OG innovators. To give you a little bit of like an idea, it's like my partner and I went to Ashoka for a little getaway, and they're a mixed barley and dairy farm. And they have this tractor there where in it there's a emission tracker. But because every time when the emission is, like reach a certain point, it just breaks down because you're emitting too much. So they just pull it out because it takes 8 hours to get an engineer to come out. And it's just kind of like, the harvest needs to continue, production needs to continue, so we have to think on the spot, and that's what we meant by them being like OG innovators. How can we do better in the space? But that's a bit of what we see.
If I can just point out something there, there is a bit of an industry, not an industry bias, but a bias against the industry, where maybe people see a bit of a resistance to change and a resistance to innovation within the industry. I'll give you an example. I was in Medellin in Colombia in March, and we were working with a group of local entrepreneurs on sort of rural community innovations and new ideas. And one of the things they were trying to push was using vertical farming for sort of very small, sort of nearly at-home family production of vegetables. And one of the things they were noticing is that people would not want to adopt the new technology because they didn't understand it, because they thought vertical farming, they're used to farming being horizontal, being on the ground, not vertical. And I've seen this quite a few times, especially when we're talking about very early stage, especially when we're talking about smallholder farmers, when we're talking about even, community production, so not innovation at a very large scale, not within the large corporates. There is a bit of a resistance to change. There is a bit of a resistance to innovation. And so the question there is, what have you seen in this? Do you think that it's an unfair bias, or do you think that is a problem that exists?
Yeah. I love this sort of like take into, coming into this space and understanding our narrative is entirely based on our own biases. And so we do a lot of producer tours at Sproutix within and also outside a cohort, and also any space available for public members as well, just to really understand not just the kind of technology the producers use, but their boneyard as well. So anytime you go on a producer tour, definitely ask to say, can I poke around? What have you purchased that didn't really work well? Can we have a look and understand why? And we've been going to sites where they produce literally, Australia's largest cilantro farm, parsley, herbs, microgreen. And when we went and looked at their irrigation system, it's literally a bunch of levers and knobs, and they're all rusty, and it looks very dangerous. And there's a massive whiteboard over there. And I can just imagine like AgTech founders going and be like, oh, here's Excel, wonderful technology, you should adopt. So I just feel like it's really interesting how no matter how many producer tours we do, that immediate idea of, changing paper to computer to phone, it's sort of like the entry point of what they think the immediate innovation could be, but really it's not change that they are resisting, it's a change management that they cannot afford. Because if you shut down everything to change into a new system, you're not harvesting, you're not irrigating it, you're not distributing, you're not trying to bid for a slot for Coles and Woolies to get your produce in, and that that could have like that's literally their lifeline, life for their income for an entire year. So I think change management is definitely the place where I'm really interested to see how AgTech founders can incorporate, whether it's the transition to tech or aftercare, customer service as well.
I will add something here, because I actually think this is something that a lot of people misunderstand, which is that I think that it's not the right frame to think of it as resistance to adoption. I think that the right frame is it's risk management. Farming is effectively risk management. And you imagine a world where you don't control input prices, you don't control output prices, you don't control the fundamental things that determine whether or not your crop will be successful, right? So you're already 3 major risks backward. And someone comes to you and says, try this new thing, it may or may not work. It's like, you know? Yeah. And so I think that, you know, when we see people, you know, saying that adoption is a problem, generally our conclusion is you haven't found the money yet, right? And farmers, you know, are very good at adopting things that lower their risk, improve their profit, allow them to do things more efficiently, better, but don't increase the risk over what for average humans would be an already intolerably high level of risk.
Want to add anything?
Yeah, I do. Actually, a very good point from Matt. If you come from a risk, like a de-risking mindset as well, we know of a precision ag weed management company that's for the price point that they're selling it for, the farmer's like, I don't know. But one of their side offer was to deal with fall armyworms, right? So it's nothing related to weed, nothing related to what they buy it for. But because having that in mind, they're like, yeah, this makes sense in terms of return on investment over 1 year. Sure, we'll adopt it. So again, anything that sort of, if you can understand exactly what risk factors, how they operate, and if you can address a few of them, that's the way to go.
So I'm going to park the adoption bit for a second. We'll go back to it, and we'll go back to sort of trying to understand how there are maybe ways of facilitating adoption through de-risking certain things, and talk a little bit more about the sources of innovation. So, you know, in some industries, you take biotech, you take pharma, traditional commercialization usually comes from either academic research or private R&D that then gets commercialized through some sort of vehicle, whether it be within a corporation or whether it be through a spin-off, a startup, whatever you want to call it. Does that model work in AgTech as well? Where do the sources of innovation come from? And does a traditional commercialization approach work? Or if not, you know, you, Maxi, you come from an accelerator perspective. Matt, you come at it from a more venture capital investment perspective. Where have you seen some of the founders, the entrepreneurs that you interact with come from in this space?
What's on your portfolio?
Yeah. I mean, so Jupiter Ionics, you know, classic Monash University spin out from a world recognized, you know, peer review published chemistry lab, right? And founded by some of the original researchers, and then a CEO brought in to run the spun out company. Rapid Aim actually went through one of the really early CSIRO on programs and were sort of spun out. So, you know, Nancy Shellhorn, the co-founder and CEO, was a published entomologist prior to becoming an awesome founder. GoTerra, Olympia put maggots in a bucket and bred the flies herself, right? And no doubt, you know, different overlays, and they have collaborated with universities and with CSIRO, you know, to solve particular problems, but in no way, you know, represents any kind of conventional commercialization model, or for that matter, kind of sourcing. So I think in the end, where we get to conviction as an investor is, does the world want to solve that problem, right? So Jupiter, does the world want to be able to make, you know, solar-powered on-farm ammonia, right? Yes, of course. Is it possible? Okay. Like, you know, that's early stage investing, and that's kind of partly where the technical risk comes into it. So I think the short answer, maybe after a very long answer, is especially where you're trying to bend laws of biology, chemistry, physics to get to the place you need to get to, that probably increases the chances of it being, you know, kind of sourced through academic research, where it's perhaps more applied and integrated. I mean, BSF, you know, was decently well known. You know, Olympia is much more, I think, an integrator and innovator than a, you know, kind of researcher scientist. But does the world want, you know, organic waste management solutions that don't, you know, mean burying stuff in holes in the ground? Definitely.
I really like the integrated part. I like to say that the Sproutix portfolio almost seems like a ragtag group of people from all walks essentially. So it's funny because when I first started Sproutix and I had a look at who all of these founders are and what their background is, over 80% of them don't even come from ag. And also the same goes for our Future Founders program as well. The last cohort, 90% comes from outside of ag. And I'm talking about outside of ag, like pharma, film industry, people from mining, people from defense, and that really speaks to the tech agnostic part. So one thing that we're trying to do here is very much a call to arms. Problem first, challenge first. Anyone who can affect this, come through, partner up. You want to partner with a researcher, with a producer. Yeah, that's kind of like the way that we see, as opposed to this is a really perfect typecast to work into it. They usually will figure out and sort of like consolidate into categories of what they want to affect.
Actually, mate, just to backtrack, because I actually think it's a really good example, which is Zanio. They started as a classic spin out. The original technology was microwave. It got great support from industry, from GEC and other investors. The founders who were brought in to run it, really brought in the kind of founder perspective. So a lot of customer engagement, a lot of really deep analysis. They eventually worked out that the technology wasn't going to meet the performance profile of the market. Rather than walk away, because they had spent so much time with customers and realised how badly farmers wanted better solutions for weed management, they thought, okay, well, what else is out there? And they went and found something else out there and have effectively, relaunched the company on the exact same problem with a different solution, and ultimately through a much more circuitous kind of commercialization route. But I think it's a really interesting kind of, look at how hard it is to apply a single one of those models. But when you have confidence that the problem really needs to be solved, I think is really where you have to land.
Okay, so we have two of our pillars, our ingredients that we've talked about, sort of adoption and the sources of the innovation. The third bit, which is sometimes a little bit of a touchy subject, is policy. And how do policymakers, how does policy play a role in this? Agriculture in a lot of countries is a highly sensitive industry. Often there are certain regulatory and protectionist barriers towards cross-border agricultural innovation, cross-border agricultural collaboration. So where do you see, not just in Australia, but also other examples you've seen maybe in the world of how policy can actually help and policymakers can help de-risk and sort of accelerate this idea of innovating agriculture and food production as well?
Actually, like your example about this accelerator often.
Oh, yeah.
One. Yeah. That's a really good one.
So
That was a Dorothy Dixon.
The Dorothy's here.
Very good. Right. Anyone here from Estonia? No. Does anyone?
Knows Estonia.
Excellent. I think there's one delegate at the conference from Estonia. So the likelihood of them being here was quite low. Does anyone know of a program called Accelerate Estonia? If someone's nodding.
Yeah,
fascinating program. What they do is obviously Estonia is a small country, million-ish people, and has a lot of concentration of foreign startups working in the country. One of the things they've done is they have this program called Accelerate Estonia, which basically will take your idea as a startup and will lobby the government to pass an ad hoc legislation that will allow you for a certain amount of time to test your idea without having to comply with regulatory hurdles or with any sort of regulation. Well, any sort-ish. For example, Estonia was one of the first countries in Europe to allow autonomous vehicles to operate on roads and in traffic. And how did they do that? They passed a 6-month law naming the specific startup that was allowed to test their vehicles on the roads in the country. Now that's an extreme model. Does that apply to agriculture? I don't know. It's a bit more sensitive. Estonia is thinking of moving. By the way, I do not represent the Estonian government, but I just really like this as an example. Estonia is now moving this into medtech and pharma as well. So they're decreasing regulation to allow startups to test new medical technologies within the country as well. Obviously, that's a bit of an experiment that could go horribly wrong, but we'll see what happens with that. The question here, are there models that we could think about in the AgTech and the food production space, in the sustainability and climate space, that would allow us to test new technologies and create that evidence that increases adoption, back to what we were saying earlier, in a slightly easier and less bureaucratic environment.
I can go first because I also know that policymaker has just entered a group chat into the room. But I think really like all commercial, like the pathway to commercialization, all you really need is a really healthy test bed. That's really it. There's really not a lot of, I guess, obviously, factor in the constraints that you have, environment, I guess, appetite, ability to affect, but really it's just good test beds as well. Like there's programs like us, which Matt calls trainers, and then scouts to go find horses to come and run races. But there's also, infrastructure for a good site practice round and also different prongs. I guess, all the innovators that we talked of previously, the CSIRO, the academia, the research labs as well. But I think outside of this, I think where we're also wanting to get as well is to really ensure that there's a lot of accessible, good, relevant infrastructure for founders to access as well. So I feel like to me, that's probably the first place to look at in terms of policy as well. And if you don't have it yet, run funding through a pipeline, figure out where the leakage is, figure out what your priorities are. But that's from an accelerator programs perspective, but not sure from an AgTech or from a VC perspective.
Yeah, I mean, so AgTech. So back in my founder times, we were a very early AgTech company, and largely, even though originated in Australia, largely ended up expanding outside of Australia. And it was a real frustration to me that we had a lot of trouble attracting employees into our business, and it's just because nobody knew that that was a place to work. So I think in one area, it's literally choosing to focus. And so what we have said about Australia is, if you asked people outside of Australia what Australia is well known for, they might say beaches and sharks and things that can kill you. They might say agriculture, right? And so if there's only a small number of things you can be good at, double down on a small number of things that you can realistically be good at. When we talk to founders, like we seem to value focus everywhere except in government policy, and I don't really understand why that is. So I think, pick key areas of kind of industry development. For sure, we already touched build racetracks, train trainers, don't breed racehorses. But I think co-investment funds are a really good idea. They're highly leveraged. And so I think that there are, and then outside of that, yes, there's regulatory uncertainty is worse than even draconian regulatory certainty, right? So either put in a moratorium, like the sort of thing that you were talking about, what we've sort of advocated for in AgTech around autonomy, because it will limit the degree to which these things get adopted and or create opportunities to kind of really get a jump on, okay, well, what does it mean to have an autonomous vehicle cross a road in a regional area, right? Like, is it really that risky? What would a nationwide third-party insurance policy cover it? Because the risk of anything going wrong is so remote. When it does go wrong, it will be bad, and so it's kind of outsized. It's probably well suited for that kind of thing. So look at the ways that you can remove blockers rather than try and develop comprehensive regulation, which you really don't know what it needs to look like until you've done it for a while anyway.
And I get how, when it comes to policies, the creation of it and the execution of it probably couldn't catch up to the number of years the cabinet is in, right? So there's obviously the whole a mutual goal that everyone wants to reach, but in lieu of that or before that, representation is also, a narrative is really important as well. So in Australia, ag has just been combined with climate. And it's really fascinating because even when we were preparing this session as well, the original narrative and a narrative that Sproutix used to run back in the days was, and I think it's still on our website, of this is an industry of XX billion dollars and all the opportunities. But now we're hearing the narrative switch into very much call to arms to say emissions. We really need, there's a growing population, or even if we're focusing on production, what about the nutritional value? So it's really, I think, important to set the right tone and also pick the right poster child as well, right? If you wanted to highlight particular startups, you want to be able to ensure that they're well represented, and future founders coming in will be able to be like, oh cool, I also want to do maggots in a bucket, and then nothing else. So that's our perspective on it.
Thank you. This sort of brings us quite nicely to the final point. I realize the big clock thing says 8 minutes, so we should leave a few minutes for questions. Hopefully there'll be a few questions. The thing I want to talk about last, and this is one of the things that with Oxentia we do the most, is looking at not just what we can do in individual countries, what we can do in individual regions, but how this can be seen really as an international ecosystem. What do I mean by that? I was earlier listening to another session that was talking about how programs and startup support programs can evolve and should evolve in response to things like new technologies. And one thing that struck me was that everyone was talking about it from the perspective of their country, of what was happening in their country, their government's accelerator programs, their universities' commercialization programs. And we work in over 70 countries, so we have programs that tend to bring together founders and entrepreneurs from different regions and different countries. And that's what I think is missing in a lot of the way in which we develop early stage innovation, including in the ag space. And I can give you a couple of examples in a second. But this idea that we should probably be rethinking the way we see programs and the way we as the title says, de-risk investment by building companies that are international from day one. So thinking about internationalization as a founder, as an entrepreneur from day one, not as something that you can only do when you're scaling up, but actually that you should be doing when you're starting up. An example of this, on a program I was running a while ago, we had a cohort of entrepreneurs from South Africa, and one of the people was developing I was telling you the story the other day, a manual hay baling machine, so a machine that you could make hay bales from without needing a tractor, without needing any source of power. And she thought she had done some market research with smallholder farmers in South Africa and in Kenya, and she found that there was a demand there. And then actually through the program we were running, she came to the UK and we introduced her to people from the Royal Agricultural University in the UK. And her first idea was, oh, maybe there's a market for me in the UK. Well, realized that maybe the manual side of things was not the case. But what she hadn't realized was that there were a whole range of other ecosystems, Latin America, elements of Southeast Asia, some of Central Europe, where manual smallholder farming is actually quite prevalent for a number of reasons. And so actually what we worked with her on was redefining her business model, not to appeal just to where she was from, to her local ecosystem, but think about it on a global stage. Now, the reason why we mentioned those things about adoption, about policy, and about everything we talked about earlier was because those sometimes are barriers to this idea of internationalizing from an early stage. But is there a way in which we can try pushing? Is there a new model of developing and implementing innovation in the agricultural space that allows us to think internationally from day one, that allows us to get founders and entrepreneurs to think more internationally from the very start? That is the sort of ultimate question of today's session.
Very long question, yes.
Yes, very long question, sorry.
I think I understand where you're going with.
Good.
We had a mentor previously with Sprout Eggs, and his choice of word is he's also an old grandpa. So his choice of words is kind of like very blunt. Define old without Asian genes. Yeah. But yeah, like the way that it's like sharp, straight to the point. He's like, you need to think global or die local. And it sounds really kind of like, very kind of like doomsday, but really at the end of the day, it's just more options, right? You just wanted to hear more stories, see how people are doing different things. And actually a story that I love to share is from this wonderful chap called Guy Coleman, who's created this thing called, I think it's called Weed AI, Open Weed. Yeah, so it's like precision ag, weed data, but it's on GitHub for free. It's open source. And there's like 15 people across the world doing this outside of their day jobs, essentially. So think of why open source is helpful in the ag perspective. Imagine you want to create technology for weed management on a strawberry farm, but because in ag tech, the iteration cycle is so dependent on nature, if the strawberry patch dies, you don't really have anything to work off from. If you don't have access because of whatever issues, you can also work. So imagine there's just like a data dump of all sort of different soil, humidity, temperature, climate, and then pictures and snapshots, so you can plug them into machine learning for it, saving so much time. And you don't need any policy changes for that as well. And it's just really cool. But that's probably kind of like a very apt grassroots movement that cross borders that we love to see more of.
Yeah, I think actually it goes a bit back to the kind of policy question, which is what do you want as the good outcome? I think Australia can be challenging in that way because it's a decently large agricultural economy, and so you can get decently large. But things happen, things are done here, like the crops that we grow, how we grow them, the conditions that we grow them in. And so sometimes a company will get a long way down the path and find that they're like so specialised to Australia, it's very hard to back up. So I think you're 100% right. Like the more you can raise awareness, the other advantage, of course, is wouldn't it be great for farmers in any country, but stick with Australia, to have access to the best possible innovation? So the other side of that, of course, is you want to be welcoming, right? So that idea of the Estonia, like the testing ground, I think that's really important too. But the third is, in a venture lens, where do you think the returns are going to come from, right? Because, and I don't mean that just with respect to a venture fund. It is a challenge for venture funds too, but like, is the return having an ecosystem of fabulous entrepreneurs, and maybe their first companies didn't go anywhere, but we've gone from having 1,000 founders to 10,000 founders. So in that, what is the return? Is the return growth of the ecosystem? Is the return that Australia continues, or that the country in question continues to have access to the best possible innovation and is seen as welcoming to all innovators, seen as a innovation-friendly environment? And I think then the third is, there's some level at which some things do need to be done by governments, right? Some things just, the economics are never going to be there to be fully self-sustaining for certain kinds of innovation. Standards development could be an area as well. I mean, you touched briefly on kind of climate and emissions, but GWP 100 versus GWP 20 versus GWP star probably will end up having the biggest impact on agriculture of anything at all beyond actual climate change, because the pressure that's on methane at the moment is entirely policy driven, and yet it's manifesting itself in really material ways and will continue to do so until something changes. And so sometimes policy can be very, very impactful and not necessarily in a positive way.
So if I can suggest something, and maybe the where we're going towards is that a place like Australia could be seen, being a fairly large country and a fairly large sort of agricultural economy as well, could be seen as a place to attract early stage innovation from around the world, be used as a test bed, allow people like yourselves to support and to invest in some of these innovations coming in, being adopted, or at least being tested here, being, the concept is proven at a large enough scale, and then adopted more widely globally by then re-internationalizing after having come locally. So is that a model that maybe we could think about?
You could do, like, here cohorts have to be 50% international. You could do, we only fund accelerator programs that have collaboration with, with kind of sister city accelerator programs. I mean, I think you're right. If what you were proposing is you really have to start, whichever way, at the top of the funnel, so to speak, when people are really thinking about the problems. Because what we, on the venture end, the thing that ends up getting away normally is the business model and the go-to-market. And those tend to be the things that actually are shaped most by geography. And so if you can kind of intervene earlier, you're much more likely to retain flexibility there, or at least have the founder sort of, running different go-to-market strategies in different geographies much earlier in their journey.
Agree.
Good. The clock is telling us we've run out of time, but we did start 5 minutes late, so maybe we can take 5 more minutes. I wanted to see if there's anyone in the audience wanted to add anything, any comments, any questions from anyone. We have someone. I can lend you my microphone.
Hi there. So I'm a bit curious. So like farming is like a low margin business. So I think it's somewhere about 3%. So I used to work in a cafe, and so they would make about $4,000 a day in revenue. And so if you do the maths on that, it's about $120 profit a day. And so you're talking about like risk management and like basically it's like the more mistakes you make that sort of just eats into that tiny profit margin of say 120 out of 4,000. And then there's also kind of, I feel like the same problem in deep tech as in farming, where in the IT space, you don't need a huge amount of resources to start a company or solve a problem. But in these other spaces, you need a huge amount of capital and infrastructure and stuff like that. And then I guess thirdly would be, so like farmers actually only make about 13%. So from the time it goes from the phrase they use in New Zealand, farm to fork kind of thing, the farm only gets about 13%. And then I guess lastly, there'd be, I guess my question is, I feel like the answer to it might be something almost like Tesla, where they're kind of end to end, where they get parts in one end, they send cars out the other end. And then I guess the question is that even possible in a farming sense? And then I guess maybe an observation would be something like Fonterra, where they also have a huge amount of revenue. And I think they also own a lot of the land as well. So they'd be sort of close to an end-to-end kind of producer where they've got all the farms, they make the milk powder, they send it away, sell it to China, make huge amounts of money. So do you think it would even be possible to have an end-to-end thing? And would that be a good idea? You might just end up making a giant monopoly.
Yeah, thanks for the thoughtful question. Australian figures I saw recently. So the problem with averages is the problem with averages, right? But I think in Australia it's closer to 25% of the retail dollar that ends up going back to a farmer. The thing is that really good farmers make very good profit, and marginal farmers make marginal profit or don't at all, and rely on the underlying increase in value of the asset to kind of keep them doing what they're doing. So I think sort of assuming that we can generally increase the percent that goes back to the farmer, like just very, very difficult problem to solve. Innovation will absolutely help there. But our feeling as an investor is when companies come to us talking about consumers will pay more and more of that money will flow back as sort of margin to farmers, that we're generally pretty skeptical of those things. There's not a lot of good history behind it. There is absolutely opportunities and vertical integration or different kinds. So one of our investment thematics we call democratized infrastructure. So some of the wonderful things about the combination of digital and hard tech or deep tech is realistically you can have the equivalent of a Haber-Bosch facility in a regional site in a small regional town if something like Jupiter works, right? So we will bust up the kind of economic building blocks of some of those value chains that you're talking to. That's probably the stuff that we're most hopeful about, is sort of rather than saying those agri-food value chains are wrong or they're not working, it's like let's back technologies that will completely bust them apart and let the economics kind of be redivided, and the people who deserve the bigger chunk at least have a decent crack at keeping a decent chunk. And so that takes me to the what I took as the third party question, which is, a lot of it, like our saying is you can't eat software, right? And so we are largely dealing in atoms and molecules, not bits and bytes. It is capital intensive, but on the other side, we're substituting what's called, novelty risk for uncertainty risk. So if you can make liquid ammonia, farmers already know how to use it, right? So you don't have to tell them how to use a different fertilizer or convince them that this biological magic stuff works the same as the traditional nitrogen fertilizer that they're already using. So so yes, there is often a lot more technical risk, but the great opportunities are where once the technical risk is solved, there's no market risk. If you can create power in a shipping container and drop a shipping container on site, people already know how to use electricity, and they're happy to not have to pay a utility for that if they can buy a box that makes it.
And one thing, just to add, that I find really fascinating that comes from fintech trajectory of the evolution of startup, you do have very niche working together to become an end-to-end. When you get too big, you also start getting broken down as well. So it's really, I guess, just a very normal flow of market, and also how small can you break down for the farmer to just solve this one small thing, as opposed to the rest.
Add to that, I guess there'd be one idea where you own all these farms that make 5 different ingredients and then have their own kind of Coles-esque supermarket thing. But you could also have this vertically integrated in, like, you own a pea protein farm and you have a store that sells your pea protein product at the end of the line. So it doesn't, like, you don't necessarily have to get so big that you're going to blow apart your giant bureaucracy. Like, I feel like you could be end-to-end in a sort of narrow.
Yeah, there's plenty of niche verticals for sure, and a lot of the technologies we're talking about will absolutely enable that.
Sorry,
I think
Matt.
we're getting
I think
hurry up here.
we're getting definitely
Yeah.
told that we should wrap up. So if anyone has any other questions or any other comments, you can find us. We'll
Come
be
stalk
around.
us.
Come
Yes.
stalk us. We should take a picture before we end. But thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Maxi.
Thank you
Matt.
very much.